The autumn of 1872 had bled the color from the Texas borderlands, leaving behind a world of rust and bone under a sky so vast and empty it felt like God had turned his back on it. The Rio Grande, thin and shallow this time of year, whispered over smooth stones, its voice the only sound in the deep, chilling quiet of the night. A sliver of moon hung in the blackness, casting just enough cold, silver light to make the shadows long and menacing. It was a light that didn't comfort, but revealed. It showed the bleached trunk of a long-dead cottonwood, its branches like skeletal fingers reaching for something they could never grasp. It shimmered on the dark, unblinking water, and it illuminated the struggle by the river's edge. The man, Jedediah, was built like a bull, with a thick neck and hands that seemed made for crushing rock. He dragged the young woman, Abigail, as if she were a sack of feed he was tired of carrying. Her worn calico dress was torn at the shoulder, and the thin leather of one of her shoes had given way, causing her to stumble and trip on the uneven, rocky ground. Her breath came in ragged, desperate gasps, small white puffs of air that vanished instantly into the cold. She did not scream. The time for screaming had passed long ago. Back at the miserable shack her father called home, when Jedediah had thrown the last of the corn whiskey down his throat and announced it was time to collect on his debt. Her father, a man hollowed out by grief and bad choices, had not met his eyes. He had simply looked at the dirt floor as his only daughter was hauled out into the night. "Be still, girl," Jedediah snarled, his voice a low growl that was swallowed by the immense silence of the landscape. He gave her arm a vicious shake, and a pained whimper escaped her lips. "You're mine now, bought and paid for. The sooner you learn your place, the better it'll be for you." His words were heavy with the sour smell of whiskey and a mean-spirited satisfaction. He saw her not as a person, but as a settlement, a thing. He shoved her forward, and she fell hard, her hands and knees scraping against the sharp-edged river stones. The pain was a distant, familiar echo. It was the fear that was sharp and immediate, a cold blade twisting in her gut. She could feel the vibrations of his heavy footsteps as he came to stand over her, his shadow eclipsing the meager moonlight. He was breathing hard, a sound of exertion and rising anger. "Get up," he commanded. She pushed herself up slowly, her body trembling not just from the cold, but from a bone-deep exhaustion. She had been fighting, in her own quiet way, for hours, twisting, pulling, trying to find a moment of leverage, a second of inattention. But he was relentless. Now, by the whispering water, she knew her strength was gone. She looked up at him, her face pale in the moonlight, her eyes wide and dark with a terror that had aged her years in a single night. He saw the defiance still flickering in those eyes, a tiny spark he was determined to extinguish. "I said, get up on your feet. You'll learn to listen when I speak." When she didn't move fast enough, his patience, already worn thin, snapped. He reached down, grabbing a fistful of her dark, tangled hair, and yanked her head back. A raw cry of pain was torn from her throat. "Please," she sobbed, the word breaking apart. "Please don't. I'm already hurt." The plea seemed to fuel his rage rather than quell it. It was the plea of the weak, and it disgusted him. "Hurt," he sneered, his face contorting into an ugly mask of contempt. "You don't know what hurt is yet, but you're fixin' to learn." He raised his free hand, a thick, calloused slab of a hand, ready to bring it down across her face. The air grew still. The river seemed to hold its breath. Abigail squeezed her eyes shut, her body tensing for the inevitable blow, a blow she had felt before from other hands, in other dark rooms. She braced herself for the flash of pain, the ringing in her ears, the taste of blood. Click! The sound was not loud, but it cut through the night with the sharp, clean finality of a breaking bone. It was a metallic sound, precise and deadly. Jedediah's hand froze in midair. His entire body went rigid. It was a sound every man in this part of the country knew. a sound that spoke a language clearer than any words. It was the sound of a pistol's hammer being cocked. Slowly, every muscle in his thick neck straining. Jedediah turned his head. Out of the deep shadows cast by a cluster of mesquite trees, a figure had emerged. He hadn't been there a moment before. It was as if the night itself had given birth to him. He was tall and lean, a silhouette against the pale landscape. He stood perfectly still, not 20 feet away. The moonlight caught the long barrel of the Colt Peacemaker in his right hand. The gun was held steady, aimed not at Jedediah's head or his chest, but casually, almost carelessly, at the ground between them. It was an insultingly calm gesture that was somehow more menacing than a direct threat. The stranger said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence was a physical presence, heavier and more profound than the night around them. He wore dark, trail-worn clothes and a low-brimmed hat that cast his face in complete shadow. There was no telling his age or the look in his eyes, but there was an aura of absolute stillness about him, the unnerving calm of a predator that knows it has no need to rush. Jedediah, still holding Abigail's hair, straightened up, trying to puff out his chest and project an authority he no longer felt. His voice, when it came out, was a weak imitation of its earlier growl. "This ain't your concern, mister. This is a private matter between me and my property." The stranger remained silent. The gun did not move. The only thing that seemed to shift was the weight of the air, growing heavier, colder. A light breeze rustled the dried leaves on the ground, a sound like whispering voices. Jedediah licked his dry lips. The whiskey courage was evaporating fast, replaced by the cold sweat of primal fear. He was a bully and a brawler, used to terrifying miners with broken-down spirits and women with no one to defend them. He was not a gunman. He could see it now, in the stranger's posture, in the way he held that gun as if it were an extension of his own arm. This man was not like him. This was something else entirely. "I said, this ain't none of your business," Jedediah shouted, his voice cracking. He gave Abigail's head a slight shake, as if to prove his ownership. "Her PA gave her to me. She's mine." The stranger took one slow step forward. The crunch of his boot on the gravel was the only sound. He still did not speak. He didn't raise the gun. He didn't have to. The message was clear. Jedediah's bravado shattered. He could feel the stranger's unseen eyes on him, and he felt as though they were stripping him down to the cowardly core he kept hidden beneath layers of bluster. He saw his own death in that silence, a quick, unremarkable event that wouldn't cause the river to stop flowing or the moon to dim. He was nothing. With a curse that was half sob, he let go of Abigail's hair. She crumpled to the ground, a heap of torn calico and trembling limbs. "She ain't worth dying for," Jedediah spat, trying to salvage a last shred of dignity. He took a clumsy step backward, his eyes darting between the silent man and the darkness behind him. "You can have her. She's more trouble than she's worth anyway." He continued to back away, stumbling over the uneven terrain, his hands held up slightly in a gesture of surrender. He never took his eyes off the stranger until he was swallowed by the shadows from which the man had come. For a long moment, the only sound was that of his frantic, crashing retreat through the underbrush, a sound that grew fainter and fainter until it was gone. And then there was only silence again. But it was a different kind of silence now. The natural, peaceful quiet of the river had been broken, and in its place was a heavy, watchful stillness. Abigail remained on the ground, her face pressed against the cold, damp earth. Sobs racked her body, silent, convulsive shudders of relief and terror. The blow had not fallen, but the fear of it remained, a phantom ache in her bones. The stranger did not move for a full minute, listening, ensuring the threat was well and truly gone. Then, another soft click echoed in the night as he gently lowered the hammer of the Colt and slid it back into its worn leather holster. The motion was fluid, economical, the practiced movement of a man who had done it 1,000 times before. He walked toward her, his steps slow and measured. He stopped a few feet away, his tall form blocking the moonlight. She could see the scuffed toes of his boots. She flinched, instinctively curling into a tighter ball, expecting a kick, a harsh word, another demand. But none came. He simply stood there, waiting. Finally, cautiously, she lifted her head. His face was still mostly in shadow, but she could see the hard line of his jaw and a mouth set in a neutral, unreadable expression. He made no move to touch her, no move to speak. He just watched her, his presence a silent question. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself into a sitting position. Every part of her ached. She wrapped her arms around her knees, trying to hold herself together, trying to stop the violent trembling that still shook her frame. She stared at the man, this quiet phantom who had appeared from the darkness, and she didn't know if she had been saved or simply passed from one captor to another. His silence was a void, and her fear rushed to fill it with terrible possibilities. But as the moment stretched on and he did nothing but stand there, a strange sort of calm began to settle over her. His stillness was not threatening. It was patient. He crouched down, balancing on the balls of his feet. The movement was surprisingly graceful for a man his size. He was closer now, and she could see a bit more of his face. It was a lean, weathered face, carved by sun and wind. There were lines around his eyes, though she couldn't see the eyes themselves. He reached out a hand, not toward her, but toward the torn sleeve of her dress, his fingers hovering just above the fabric for a second before he let his hand drop back to his side. It was a gesture of assessment, clinical and detached. Then, without a word, he stood up, turned, and walked a few paces away. He bent down and picked something up. When he returned, he was holding a canteen. He knelt again, unscrewed the cap, and offered it to her. She stared at the canteen, then back at his shadowed face. Her throat was raw, her lips cracked and dry. She reached out with a trembling hand and took it. Her fingers brushed against his, and she was surprised by the warmth of his skin. His hand was rough with calluses, but his touch had been steady and not at all violent. She lifted the canteen and drank, the cool water a balm to her parched throat. She drank until she could breathe again, then handed it back to him. He took it, screwed the cap back on, and clipped it to his belt. Then he rose to his full height and simply stood there again, waiting. It was clear he expected her to get up. She tried, but a wave of dizziness washed over her, and the world tilted. The fear, the running, the fall that had all taken its toll. A soft cry escaped her as she swayed, her legs refusing to hold her. Before she could fall, he was there. He moved with a speed that belied his calm demeanor. One strong arm went around her back, the other under her knees, and he lifted her from the ground as if she weighed nothing at all. The world spun, and she instinctively clutched at his shirt, her face pressing against the rough, dusty fabric that smelled of leather, wood smoke, and the cold night air. He held her for a moment, letting her find her balance in his arms. Then he turned and began to walk, away from the river, away from the place of her terror, and deeper into the vast, silent darkness of the Texas night. He did not speak a single word. The world was a dizzying sway of shadow and moonlight, a rhythmic jolting that matched the steady, muffled beat drumming against her ear. Abigail drifted in a fog of exhaustion, too weak to open her eyes for more than a flutter. Each time she did, the dark shapes of trees slid past, their branches like black veins against a bruised purple sky. She was aware of the solidness of the arms that held her, the unyielding strength in the chest she was pressed against. It was a strange and terrifying sort of intimacy. This man was a cipher, a creature of the night who had dealt in violence on her behalf, and now he was carrying her off to a place unknown. Every instinct screamed that she should be afraid, that she should fight, but her body had no fight left in it. The terror had burned itself out, leaving behind a hollow, quivering emptiness. What struck her, in moments of fleeting clarity, was the nature of his hold. The man who had dragged her to the river, Jedediah, had been all sharp angles and cruel force. His grip was a vice, intended to punish and control. This was different. The stranger's arms were like bands of weathered oak, immovable and strong. But the pressure was even, secure. It was not a gesture of possession. It was one of pure function, as if he were carrying a wounded animal or a delicate piece of machinery that required careful transport. His stride was long and unbroken, the pace of a man who knew exactly where he was going and was in no hurry to get there. He moved through the dense, dark woods with an unnerving confidence, never stumbling, never hesitating. The only sounds were the crunch of his boots on the dry earth and leaf litter, the soft creak of his leather gear, and the steady, powerful rhythm of his own breathing. He was an island of purpose in a sea of silent, indifferent nature. She didn't know how long they walked. Time had dissolved into a sequence of disjointed sensations, the cold night air on her face, the faint scent of pine and dust, the subtle shift of his muscles as he navigated the uneven ground. She should have been cold in her torn dress, but a strange, radiating warmth came from his body, a dry heat that held the chill at bay. At some point, she must have drifted into a shallow, fitful sleep, for she was startled awake when the rhythm of his walking stopped. He had paused in a small, secluded clearing. Ahead of them, barely visible in the faint moonlight, stood a cabin. It was not a welcoming sight. It was a small, severe structure of rough-hewn logs, chinked with mud and moss, looking as though it had grown out of the forest floor rather than been built upon it. A thin curl of smoke, almost invisible, rose from a stone chimney, a ghost in the darkness. There was no light in its single, small window. It was a place of solitude, a fortress against the world. It looked like the kind of place a man went to be forgotten. The stranger carried her to the heavy plank door and, with a deftness that surprised her, managed to lift the latch and push it open without jostling her. The air that rolled out from within was cool and smelled of wood ash, cured leather, and something else, a faint, clean, herbal scent she couldn't place. He stepped inside and pushed the door shut with his boot. The sound of the heavy bar sliding into its bracket was loud and final, a solid thud that sealed them in and the rest of the world out. For a moment, they were in near total darkness, the only light coming from the faint, dying orange glow of embers in a large stone fireplace. He moved across the room and gently, carefully, deposited her on a narrow cot built against one wall. The mattress was firm, stuffed with straw or corn husks, but a coarse wool blanket lay folded at its foot. He placed her on it with the same dispassionate care he had shown all along, his hands retreating the moment she was secure. Abigail pushed herself up, her back against the rough log wall, her eyes slowly adjusting to the gloom. She watched him move about the small space. He was a man of few movements, each one deliberate and necessary. He stoked the embers in the fireplace, adding a few small pieces of kindling and then a larger log. He worked the bellows with a few easy strokes, and soon, small flames licked at the wood, casting a warm, flickering light that pushed back the shadows and danced across the room. In the growing light, she saw her surroundings more clearly. The cabin was one room, Spartan and impeccably clean. Besides her cot, there was a small, sturdy table with a single chair, a set of shelves holding a few tin plates and cups, and a larger chest in the corner. His rifle was propped near the door, and his gun belt, which he now unbuckled and hung from a wooden peg, looked heavy and well used. There were no decorations, no pictures, nothing to suggest a life beyond mere survival. It was the home of a man who owned little and wanted less. Having revived the fire, the stranger turned his attention to an oil lamp on the table. He trimmed the wick, struck a match, and soon a steady, golden light filled the cabin, chasing the last of the shadows into the corners. Now, for the first time, She could see him clearly. His face, illuminated by the lamp, was as stark and weathered as the landscape outside. He was older than she had first thought, perhaps in his 30s, with deep-set eyes the color of slate under a straight, serious brow. His dark hair was cut short, and a few days' worth of stubble shadowed a square, determined jaw. There were lines etched at the corners of his eyes and mouth, lines that spoke not of laughter, but of long hours squinting into the sun and a life that had offered little to smile about. It was a face that gave nothing away, a mask of hardened control. He looked tired, but it was a weariness that seemed to have settled deep into his bones long ago. He caught her staring, and his gray eyes met hers for a brief, unnerving moment. There was no curiosity in his gaze, no pity, no threat. It was the flat, assessing look of a man observing a fact. Then he looked away, breaking the contact. He moved to the shelves and took down a small wooden box and a clean tin basin. He went outside for a moment, and she heard the squeak of a pump handle, followed by the splash of water. When he returned, he set the basin of cold, clear water on the floor beside her cot. He opened the wooden box. Inside were neatly rolled bandages, a small, dark bottle, and several clean-looking metal instruments she did not recognize. He knelt beside her without a word. He gestured toward her hands, which were scraped raw and clotted with dirt and dried blood from her fall. She hesitated, her body tensing. Every touch she had known from a man, save for her father's when she was a small child, had been a prelude to pain or possession. He did not press, he simply waited, his hands resting on his own knees, his expression unchanging. His patience was a strange, powerful force. Slowly, hesitantly, she extended her right hand. He took it gently. His grip was firm but not tight. He turned her hand over, examining the scraped palm with a detached, professional air. His fingers were surprisingly deft as he took a clean cloth, dipped it in the water, and began to clean the wound. She flinched as the cold water touched the raw skin, but his hand on her wrist was steady, holding her still. He worked with a quiet, methodical efficiency, his movements precise and economical. There was no wasted motion, no clumsiness. He cleaned every speck of gravel and dirt from the cuts, his focus absolute. When he was satisfied, he uncorked the small bottle. The sharp, antiseptic smell of carbolic filled the air. He poured a small amount onto another cloth and began to dab at her wounds. It stung, a clean, sharp pain, and she drew in a sharp breath. He paused for a second, his eyes glancing up at her face, but his expression remained unreadable. Then he continued his work, his touch just as careful, just as impersonal as before. He finished with her hands, then gestured to her scraped knees, visible through a tear in her dress. A flush of shame crept up her neck, but she did as he indicated. Pulling the ragged hem of her skirt up just enough to expose the injuries, he cleaned them with the same meticulous, dispassionate care. He worked in complete silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the quiet slosh of water in the basin. The silence was profound. Unlike any she had ever experienced, it wasn't empty. It was full of a weight and a meaning she couldn't decipher. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask what had happened, who the man was, or why he had been dragging her through the wilderness. The questions hung in the air, unspoken, and his refusal to ask them was, in its own way, a strange comfort. To speak of it would be to make it real again. His silence allowed it to remain a nightmare from which she was slowly waking. When he had finished with her knees, he stood and looked at her face. His gaze was clinical as he studied the angry red mark on her scalp where Jedediah had gripped her hair, and the dark bruise that was beginning to blossom on her cheekbone. He made no move to touch her face. It seemed a boundary he would not cross. He simply took in the information, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. His work was done. He took the basin of dirty, pink-tinged water and tossed it out the door into the darkness. He cleaned his hands, dried them on a piece of cloth, and put his supplies back into the wooden box, closing the lid with a soft click. He attended to her injuries with the skill of a surgeon, his every action speaking of a deep and practiced familiarity with blood and pain. He was a man who knew how to patch up the broken things of the world. He turned back to her. He picked up the folded wool blanket from the foot of the cot and shook it out. It was old and slightly frayed at the edges, but it was clean and smelled of wood smoke. He laid it over her, pulling it up to her chin. The gesture was so simple, so unexpectedly tender after the clinical efficiency of his doctoring, that it nearly broke the fragile composure she was clinging to. Tears pricked the back of her eyes, but she fought them down. Crying felt like a luxury she could not afford. He seemed to consider her for another moment, then turned away and walked over to the fireplace. He took the single chair from the table, placed it before the hearth, and sat down, his back to her. He stared into the flames, a silent, solitary figure. He had given her the only bed, the only blanket, and now he was giving her the illusion of privacy in the small, shared space. Abigail lay under the heavy warmth of the blanket, her body aching, her mind a numb whirlwind of confusion. The man by the fire was a complete mystery. He was a killer and a healer, a creature of violence and of quiet care. He had saved her, and he had not asked for a single thing in return. He had not even asked for her name. She watched his rigid back, the way the firelight played over his worn shirt, and she felt a profound sense of unreality. The Rio Grande, Jedediah, the terror, it all felt like something that had happened to someone else, in another lifetime. All that was real now was the crackling fire, the Spartan cabin, and the silent stranger who sat between her and the vast, dangerous night, utterly spent. Her body finally gave in to the demands of its own exhaustion. Her eyelids grew heavy, and with the silent cowboy as her unlikely guardian, Abigail fell into a deep and dreamless sleep. A profound stillness woke her. It was not the tense, listening silence of the night before, but the deep, settled quiet of the early morning. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing red embers, pulsing softly like a sleeping heart and casting a faint, warm light on the rough-hewn log walls of the cabin. The room was cold, the kind of biting chill that seeps in through the cracks just before dawn. The heavy wool blanket was a welcome weight, a shield against the world. For a long, disoriented moment, Abigail didn't know where she was. Then the memory of the river, of Jedediah's cruel grip and the sharp, clean click of a pistol's hammer, rushed back in a sickening wave. She sat up with a jolt, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The chair by the hearth was empty. A spike of pure, animal panic shot through her. He was gone. He had left her here, alone and unprotected in this vast, unforgiving wilderness. She imagined Jedediah returning, his ugly sneer triumphant in the morning light. She imagined worse things. Her eyes darted around the small, shadowy room, searching for a weapon, an escape, anything. Then she saw him, through the single, small window. She could see his silhouette moving in the pre-dawn gloom. He was standing by a chopping block, his back to her, splitting wood with a powerful, economic swing of an axe. The dull thunk of the blade sinking into wood reached her a second after she saw the motion, a steady, rhythmic sound that was somehow deeply reassuring. He hadn't abandoned her. He was simply working. Abigail sank back onto the cot, pulling the blanket up to her chin, a long, shaky breath escaping her lips. She watched him for a while. This strange, silent man. He moved with a purpose that seemed as natural and ingrained as the rising of the sun. He was a part of this harsh landscape, not a visitor to it. After a time, he finished his work and came back inside, carrying an armload of freshly split logs. He didn't seem surprised to find her awake. He didn't acknowledge her at all. He knelt at the hearth and carefully rebuilt the fire, his large, calloused hands arranging the wood with practiced care. Soon, a cheerful crackle filled the silence and new flames began to dance, pushing the chill from the room. He stood and walked to the shelves, taking down a tin coffee pot and a small sack of beans. He moved with that same quiet efficiency, grinding the beans, filling the pot with water from a bucket by the door, and setting it on a grate over the fire. The rich, bitter aroma of coffee soon began to fill the small cabin, a comforting, domestic smell that felt deeply out of place in her current reality. She couldn't bear the silence any longer. It was a weight that was pressing down on her, suffocating her. She had to know. "Who are you?" The words were a dry whisper, scratching her own throat. They sounded small and fragile in the quiet room. He didn't turn around for a long moment. He continued to watch the coffee pot as if it held the answer to a complex question. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low rumble, rough from disuse, like stones grinding together at the bottom of a riverbed. Caleb. Just the name, nothing more. No explanation of who he was or why he had intervened. He offered his name like a piece of wood for the fire, a simple, necessary fact, devoid of any decoration. He poured the steaming coffee into a single tin mug and stood by the fire, drinking it slowly, his gaze fixed on the flames. He did not offer her any. It wasn't an act of unkindness, she realized. It was simply that the thought did not seem to occur to him. He was a man accustomed to solitude, his routines built for one. The silence that followed was different. It now had a name attached to it, Caleb. It didn't make him any less of a mystery, but it gave her a word to anchor her thoughts to. The first day passed in this new, named silence. Caleb moved in and out of the cabin, tending to tasks she couldn't guess at. He checked snares, she supposed, or scouted the land. He never announced his departures or his arrivals. He would simply be there, and then he would be gone. When the sun was high in the sky, he returned and placed half a loaf of dark, dense bread and a small piece of hard cheese on the table. He did not look at her or invite her to eat. He simply left the food there and went back outside to sharpen the blade of his axe. Abigail watched the food for a long time. Hunger gnawed at her belly, a dull, persistent ache. But a lifetime of being given things only when a price was expected made her hesitant. Finally, the raw need overcame her caution. She crept to the table, tore off a piece of the bread with trembling fingers, and ate. It was coarse and dry, but it was the most precious meal she had ever had. It was food given without a word, without a look, without a demand. As she ate, she looked down at her torn and filthy dress, at the dirt caked under her fingernails. A wave of shame washed over her. She was a guest in this man's clean, Spartan home, and she was a mess of filth and ruin. She had to do something. She couldn't just sit here like a stray dog waiting for its next scrap. After Caleb left again, she got up and began to tidy the cabin. It was already clean, but she found small things to do. She swept the hearth with a makeshift broom of twigs. She straightened the wool blanket on her cot, folding it with meticulous care. She found a cloth and wiped down the small, sturdy table. They were small, feeble acts of self-worth, a way of insisting to herself that she was more than just the broken thing Jedediah had dragged to the river. She was scrubbing the tin basin he had used to clean her wounds when the story tumbled out of her. She wasn't aware of having made a decision to speak. The words just came, spilling into the quiet air of the cabin like dark water from a cracked vessel. She spoke to the empty room, to the crackling fire, to the ghost of the man who had saved her. "My PA, he had debts," she began, her voice low and hoarse. "Gambling debts. To Jedediah. He lost the last of the money Mama left us." She paused, scrubbing at a spot on the tin that was already clean. "Jedediah came to collect. We had nothing left to give him. Nothing but me." She could feel the familiar, hot sting of shame behind her eyes. Pa didn't even look at me. He just stared at the floor. Jedediah said, "He said a daughter was as good as coin. He said I'd learn to be useful to him." The words were bitter on her tongue. She didn't speak of the rough hands or the fear, only of the transaction, the cold, hard fact of being sold. It was the part that hurt the most, the knowledge that her own father had looked at her and seen only the solution to a problem. She didn't know that Caleb had returned. He moved so silently that she hadn't heard the door open or his soft footfalls on the wooden floor. She only knew he was there when his shadow fell over her. She froze, her hand stilling in the basin, her back rigid. She expected a comment, a question, perhaps even a grunt of disgust. He said nothing. He simply stood there behind her for a long moment. She could feel his presence, a solid, unmoving weight in the small room. Then he turned and walked to the large wooden chest in the corner, the one she hadn't dared to look at too closely. It seemed too personal, the only item in the cabin that suggested a past. He lifted the heavy lid. A faint, sad scent of dried lavender and cedar escaped, a ghost of a fragrance that spoke of a woman's touch. He reached inside and pulled out a small, neatly folded pile of clothing. He laid the items on the foot of her cot without a word. It was a simple, dark blue wool skirt and a cream-colored linen blouse with small, carefully mended stitches near the collar. The clothes were worn soft with use, but they were spotlessly clean and smelled faintly of that same lavender scent. They were a woman's clothes, his wife's clothes. She realized with a sudden, painful certainty. The silent offering was more powerful than any words of comfort could have been. It was an acknowledgement of everything she had said and everything she had not. It was a gift not just of clothing, but of dignity. It was his way of saying, "I see you. You are not property. You are a woman, and you deserve to be treated as one." Tears she had refused to shed now welled in her eyes and traced hot paths down her cheeks. She didn't make a sound. She simply stared at the clothes, at this tangible piece of a life that had existed in this cabin before her, a life that had ended, leaving behind only silence and a man named Caleb. The next few days settled into a strange, silent rhythm. Their lives became a quiet dance of action and reaction. She would wake before him and rekindle the fire, a skill she was slowly relearning. He would rise and leave for the woods, and when he returned, there would be a snared rabbit or a brace of quail left on the chopping block outside. She would hesitantly, clumsily, learn to clean and cook them, making a simple stew in the pot over the fire. She never asked for anything, and he never offered instruction, but he watched. He observed. When he saw her struggling to draw water from the deep well with the heavy oak bucket. The next morning she found a smaller, lighter bucket sitting by the door, a length of fresh rope coiled beside it. When he noticed her squinting in the dim light of the evening to mend the tear in her old calico dress. The next day, a small tin of needles and a spool of dark thread appeared on the table. He never presented these things to her. They would just be there, placed where she would find them. Silent solutions to unspoken problems. It was his language. He did not speak with his voice, but with his hands, with his foresight. He built a world for her out of these small, quiet actions. In return, she began to make the cabin her own in small ways. She found a patch of late-blooming wildflowers and put them in a tin cup on the table. She learned to bake a passable bread in a cast-iron skillet set in the embers of the fire. She took the worn clothes he had given her and washed them in the nearby creek, handling them with a reverence and care that felt like a prayer for the woman who had worn them before. She was tending to the memory of a ghost, and in doing so, she was tending to the broken parts of herself. She was slowly, carefully, rebuilding a life from the ashes of the one that had been stolen from her. And he was there, a silent, watchful presence, providing the wood, the water, and the unwavering, unspoken promise of safety. He didn't teach her how to survive. He simply gave her the space and the tools to remember how. The silence was no longer empty or frightening. It was becoming a foundation. the solid, quiet ground upon which something new and fragile was beginning to be built. It began with the quality of her sleep. For the first week, she had slept the sleep of the hunted, a shallow, brittle state of rest from which the slightest sound, the scuttling of a mouse in the walls, the pop of a log on the fire, would jolt her awake, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. But now, something had shifted. She found herself sinking into a deep, dreamless blackness, a place of true and profound rest she hadn't known since she was a little girl, before her mother had passed, before her father's grief had curdled into a bitter neglect. She started waking not to fear, but to the first, thin light of dawn painting the cabin's single window a pale, pearly gray. She would lie still for a moment, listening to the quiet sounds of the morning, a lone bird calling from the high branches of a pine, the soft sigh of the wind through the trees, and the slow, even rhythm of Caleb's breathing from his place by the hearth. She had realized, with a sense of quiet wonder, that she felt safe. It was a feeling so alien it was almost disorienting. Her entire life had been a practice in watchfulness, in reading the moods of angry men, in making herself small and quiet to avoid notice. Here, in the absolute solitude of the woods with a man who barely spoke, she was, for the first time, not afraid. His silence, once a source of unnerving mystery, had become a wall around her, a fortress that kept the harshness of the world at bay. He seemed to feel the shift as well. The invisible line that had been drawn between them in the small cabin began to blur. Before, he would take his meals standing by the fire or outside on the chopping block, his back to her. Now, he would sometimes sit at the small table, occupying the single chair while she sat on the edge of her cot. They would eat in their customary silence. The only sounds, the scrape of a spoon against a tin bowl or the soft crunch of hardtack. But they were sharing the space, the meal, the quiet moment. The distance between them, once measured in yards, was now only the width of the small, scarred table. One evening, a cold autumn rain began to fall, drumming a steady, lulling rhythm on the cabin's roof. The world outside was a wash of gray, and the fire in the hearth was a welcome circle of warmth and light. Abigail sat on her cot, mending a seam in the wool skirt he had given her. Caleb sat at the table, the lamplight glinting off the oily steel of his coat as he meticulously cleaned it, laying each piece out on a worn leather cloth. They worked in a comfortable, shared silence, two solitary people occupying the same small pocket of warmth against the storm. It was the closest they had ever been to feeling like a household. She was reaching for the spool of thread when her elbow knocked against the tin cup holding her wildflowers. It tipped, sending a cascade of murky water and wilted petals across the floorboards. She gasped, a small sound of dismay, and immediately knelt to clean up the mess. The water was seeping between the rough-hewn planks, worried it might damage the wood. She used the edge of a rag to sop up what she could from the cracks. As her fingers probed a wider gap between two boards, they brushed against something hard and rectangular. Curious, she worked her fingers into the gap and pulled. A small, leather-bound notebook, swollen and stiff with age and damp, came free. It was not something Caleb kept out in the open. It must have slipped through the floorboards long ago and been forgotten. She looked over at him. He was still engrossed in his work, carefully oiling the pistol's cylinder, his focus absolute. Holding the book in her hands, she felt a tremor of trespass, a sense that she was holding a secret. The leather was cracked and faded, the kind of object that had been handled 1,000 times. She opened it carefully, the stiff pages resisting. The book fell open to a page in the middle. The script inside was small and neat, written in a faded brown ink. It was not a journal or a ledger. The page was filled with precise, detailed drawings of the bones in a human hand. Next to the drawings were notes, written in a clinical, abbreviated script. Metacarpal fracture, clean break, splint with birch bark, immobilize for 4 weeks. Check for nerve damage. She turned the page. Here was a list of herbs and their uses: willow bark for fever and pain, yarrow to staunch bleeding, poultice of comfrey for swelling. Page after page was filled with similar entries, instructions for setting a dislocated shoulder, a formula for a tincture to treat lung congestion, detailed notes on how to suture a deep wound using a needle fashioned from bone and thread made of sinew. This was not the notebook of a simple cowboy or a trapper. This was the work of a man who understood the intricate, fragile machinery of the human body. It explained the detached, professional way he had cleaned her wounds, his movements so sure and practiced. It explained the small, well-organized box of medical supplies he kept on the shelf. She looked up at him again, seeing him in a new light. The quiet man cleaning his gun was a facade, a carefully constructed shell around a man who had once held a different kind of knowledge, a different kind of life, in his hands. She closed the book gently and stood up, her heart beating a little faster. She walked to the table and placed the notebook on the leather cloth, next to the disassembled pieces of his pistol. He did not look up immediately. He finished wiping down the barrel of the gun, his movements as slow and deliberate as ever, but she could see the subtle stiffening of his shoulders, the way his hands paused for a fraction of a second. He knew what she had found. Finally, he set the barrel down and lifted his head, his slate-gray eyes meeting hers. The neutral, unreadable mask was firmly in place, but she thought she could see a flicker of something else in their depths, something guarded, something pained. "It fell through the floorboards," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper above the sound of the rain. He stared at the book for a long moment, as if it were a ghost from a past he had worked hard to bury. He did not touch it. When he spoke, his voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "I was a medic in the army." The words hung in the air between them, a stark, simple confession. It explained so much and yet so little. An army medic, a man trained to save lives, to mend broken bodies on fields of battle. What was a man like that doing hiding in a remote cabin? His only companions, the silence and the trees. She wanted to ask, but she knew his story was not something to be pried open. It would only be given, if it was given at all. She simply nodded, accepting his words, and turned to go back to her cot. "Nora!" The name stopped her. It was the first time he had spoken a name other than his own. She turned back to him. He was looking at the notebook now, his gaze distant, lost in a memory. "That was her name," he said, his voice softer now, rougher around the edges. "My wife. The book was a gift from her." He finally reached out and laid his hand on the worn leather cover, his fingers tracing the faded edges. It was a gesture of such profound and gentle sorrow that it made her own throat ache in sympathy. "She believed a man ought to be useful," he continued, speaking more to the book than to her. "She said a man who knew how to heal things was the most useful of all." He gave a short, bitter laugh that held no humor. "I wasn't so useful when it mattered." He fell silent again, lost in the past. The rain drummed on the roof, a steady, mournful beat. Abigail stood by the table, a silent witness, feeling the immense weight of the grief that filled the small cabin. "There was a fever," he said at last, his voice barely audible. "It swept through the settlement downriver. I was away, helping a family whose wagon had overturned miles north. I was gone 3 days. He paused, and she could see him swallowing, his throat working. "I should have been here." He looked up from the book, his eyes finally meeting hers again. For the first time, the mask was gone. The carefully constructed wall of indifference had crumbled, and what lay beneath was a raw, bottomless chasm of pain and regret. "By the time I got back," he said, his voice breaking on the last word, "it was too late. The fever had taken hold. I did everything I knew, everything that's written in that book. I brewed the willow bark tea. I sat with her, bathing her skin with cool water." His gaze drifted toward the cot where she slept, and a new wave of pain washed over his face. She died, right there. In that bed. She died in my arms." He looked down at his own hands, splayed on the table next to the pieces of his gun, as if he were seeing them for the first time. All that knowledge, all those skills, and I couldn't save my own wife. I wasn't a medic then. I was just a husband who got home too late. He fell silent. The confession was complete. He had given her the heart of his pain, the heavy, jagged stone he had been carrying in his chest for years. He turned his head and stared into the fire, his profile a stark, rigid line against the dancing flames. And in that moment, Abigail saw it. It wasn't a tear. His eyes were dry. It wasn't a sob. His body was perfectly still. It was a flicker, a brief, almost imperceptible tremor that ran through the slate gray of his eyes, like a crack appearing on the surface of frozen water. It was a flash of the raw, unendurable agony he had lived with every single day since he had held his dying wife in his arms. It was there for only a second, a moment of pure, unguarded vulnerability. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. The ice reformed. The stone mask settled back into place, and he was once again the silent, unreadable man she had first met. But she had seen it. She had seen the man behind the mask. She didn't say a word. There were no words that could touch a grief that profound. To offer pity would be an insult. Instead, she walked back to her cot, picked up her mending, and sat down. She threaded her needle in the warm lamplight and began to stitch the seam, her movements small and quiet. She did not look at him again. She simply sat there, sharing the silence with him, her steady, quiet presence a silent acknowledgement of the burden he carried. The rain continued to fall, washing the world clean, as two lonely people sat together in a small room, bound by the things they did not ask and the terrible truth that had finally been spoken. The days following Caleb's confession were steeped in a new kind of silence. Before, it had been a quiet born of mystery, a void between two strangers. Now, it was a silence that held the weight of a shared secret, the profound and heavy quiet that settles over a gravesite. The ghost of Nora was no longer a vague presence confined to a set of old clothes. She was a fully formed memory, and Abigail saw her everywhere. She saw her in the way Caleb's gaze would sometimes linger on the empty space beside him at the table, in the careful way he tended the small patch of stubborn herbs growing by the cabin door, and in the deep, unbreachable sadness that lived behind his eyes. Abigail found herself moving with a new reverence through the small space. She was no longer just a refugee finding shelter. She was a guest in a home that was still, in every meaningful way, occupied by the memory of another woman. When she used the tin plates, she washed them with extra care. When she swept the floor, she made sure to clear every last speck of dust from the corners. She was not trying to erase Nora's presence, but to honor it. She was tending to the last visible remnants of a life, and in doing so, she was tending to the man who was its sole keeper. Caleb, for his part, seemed to have been subtly changed by the unburdening of his grief, a measure of the deep. Restless tension had eased from his shoulders. He still spent his days in the solitary pursuit of survival, but his return to the cabin in the evenings felt different. It was less the retreat of a wounded animal to its lair, and more the return of a man to a place that was, however slowly, beginning to feel like a home again. The idea for the stew came to her in fragments, whispered into the quiet air like stray notes of a half-forgotten song. One evening, as they ate a simple meal of roasted rabbit and fire-blackened potatoes, Caleb stared down at his plate, a distant look in his eyes. "Nora," he'd said, his voice a low murmur, almost to himself. "She always found wild carrots to put in the pot, said they sweetened the broth, took the gamey edge off the meat." He blinked, as if surprised by his own words, and immediately fell silent again, a curtain dropping over the brief window into his past. Abigail stored the fragment of information away in her heart. A few days later, while he was mending a tear in a leather pouch, he spoke again, his eyes focused on his work. There's a patch of wild thyme that grows down by the creek, where the flat stones are. She could find it even in the autumn. Another piece of the puzzle. Another ingredient in the recipe of a memory. The final piece came when he returned from a day-long hunt, a small deer slung over his shoulders. As he worked, dressing the animal with his usual quiet competence, he paused. She'd save a piece of the smoked bacon from the winter stores, he mused, his voice thick with remembrance. Just a small piece, for the flavor. Said a good stew needed a bit of smoke to remind you of the hearth. He didn't seem to be speaking to Abigail. He was speaking to a ghost, conjuring a presence with the taste and smell of a meal they had shared countless times. But Abigail heard. She listened to these broken memories and understood that he wasn't just talking about food. He was talking about love. He was talking about the small, specific acts of care that turn a simple meal into a sacrament. He was talking about Nora. And so, she formed a plan. It was a quiet, secret mission, an attempt to do an impossible thing to cook a memory. The next day, when Caleb left at dawn to check his trap lines, a journey that would take him until dusk, she began. She took the small piece of venison he had set aside and the last strip of smoked bacon from their meager supplies. Then, with a deep breath, she stepped out of the cabin and into the woods, not as a frightened survivor, but as a woman with a purpose. She headed for the creek, her eyes scanning the ground with an intensity she had never felt before. She found the patch of flat stones he had described, and there, growing in the crevices, was a small cluster of hardy, fragrant thyme. She gathered a few sprigs, her fingers gentle, her heart beating with a small thrill of success. The carrots were harder to find. She spent over an hour searching the undergrowth, her eyes aching from the strain. Before she found them, a small patch of feathery green tops poking through the damp earth. They were small and gnarled, nothing like the ones sold in a town market, but she dug them up with a sense of triumph, brushing the dark, rich soil from their pale orange skins. Back in the cabin, she worked with the focus of an alchemist. The small room, which had always smelled of wood smoke, dust, and Caleb's solitary masculinity, slowly began to change. A new aroma began to fill the air, rich and complex. It was the scent of the bacon sizzling in the cast-iron pot, of the venison browning in the fat, of the onions and wild carrots softening and releasing their sweetness. She added the thyme, the water from the creek, and a pinch of salt, and then she let it simmer, a slow, magical transformation taking place over the gentle heat of the fire. The smell was intoxicating. It was the smell of a home. It was the smell of a meal made not just to fill a stomach, but to warm a soul. As the stew bubbled away, she found herself thinking of Nora, this woman she had never met, and felt a strange kinship with her. She imagined Nora standing in this very spot, adding the same ingredients to the same pot, her movements filled with the easy grace of love. For a few hours, Abigail was not just cooking a meal, she was part of a lineage of care, a quiet continuation of a love story that had been interrupted by death. When Caleb returned at dusk, the first thing that hit him was the smell. He stopped dead in the doorway, his face a mask of utter confusion. He sniffed the air, his head tilted like a wolf catching a strange, familiar scent on the wind. His eyes scanned the cabin and landed on the pot simmering over the fire. Abigail's heart was in her throat. She had taken a great risk, meddling with his most sacred memories. Perhaps he would be angry. Perhaps he would see it as a trespass, a clumsy imitation of something she had no right to touch. She said nothing. She simply took 2 tin bowls, ladled the thick, fragrant stew into them, and placed them on the table. She sat on the edge of her cot, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, and waited. He walked slowly to the table, as if in a trance. He looked down at the bowl. He saw the tender chunks of venison, the precise orange circles of the wild carrots, the dark green flecks of thyme floating in the rich, smoky broth. He saw everything. He lifted his head and looked at her, and his eyes were wide with 1,000 unspoken questions. He understood what she had done. She had listened to the scattered whispers of his grief, and had painstakingly pieced them back together. She had given his memories a physical form. He sat down in his chair, his movements stiff. He picked up his spoon, his hand not entirely steady. He stared at the stew for a long, silent moment. Then, he gave a single, slow, deliberate nod. It was not a simple thank you. It was an acknowledgement of the immense and tender effort she had made. It was an acceptance of her care. It was forgiveness, for himself and for the world, all contained in one small movement. He lifted the spoon to his lips and took the first taste. A tremor went through his body. His eyes closed for a fraction of a second, and in that moment, she knew he was not in the cabin with her. He was in another time, another life, sitting at this same table with his wife. The air filled with her laughter. A shadow of the old, familiar pain crossed his face, but it was followed by something new, something soft and warm. He opened his eyes and looked at her again, and then, for the very first time, she saw him smile. It was not a wide, happy grin. It was the faintest, most fragile lifting at the corner of his mouth. It was a sad smile, a smile that held all the sorrow of his loss. But it was a smile nonetheless. It was a flicker of warmth in the long, cold winter of his grief. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. That meal changed everything. The last of the invisible walls between them dissolved into the steam of the venison stew. They still lived in a world of profound quiet, but their silence was now a shared language of deep and abiding care. Their affection for each other was written in 1,000 small, unspoken gestures. A few days later, Caleb returned from the woods to find his favorite shirt, the one with the frayed collar and the missing button, lying on his cot. The collar had been reinforced with a row of tiny, neat stitches, and a new button, carved from a piece of deer antler, had been securely sewn in place. He picked it up, running his thumb over the smooth, new button, and the ghost of that sad, gentle smile touched his lips once more. The next morning, Abigail awoke to find a perfect, iridescent blue jay feather standing upright in the crack of the wooden table. A stark slash of impossible color in the brown. Spartan cabin. It was a gift of impossible beauty, a silent offering from his world to hers. Their lives became a gentle, unspoken exchange. She would ensure a pot of hot, strong coffee was waiting for him when he came in from the cold. He would leave a pile of the driest, most fragrant kindling by the hearth, cut to the perfect size for her smaller hands. She learned to read the lines of weariness around his eyes and would have a hot meal ready for him without a word being exchanged. He learned to read the quiet droop of her shoulders and would return from the woods with a handful of sweet, wild berries, leaving them on the table for her to find. She mended his clothes. He repaired the sole of her shoe with a piece of soft, supple leather. She began to sing softly to herself as she worked, quiet, half-remembered melodies from her childhood. He began to leave his medical notebook on the table, open to a page about the healing properties of a plant he had found that day, a silent sharing of the knowledge that had once been his pride and his pain. They never spoke of love. They never spoke of the future. The words were too big, too clumsy for the fragile, beautiful thing that was growing between them in the quiet solitude of the woods. Their love was not in words. It was in the mended shirt and the blue jay feather. It was in the hot stew and the perfectly cut kindling. It was in the shared silence. A silence that was no longer empty, but filled to the brim with unspoken care. They were two lonely souls who had found each other by a dark river, and they were, stitch by silent stitch, mending a life together. The piece was a fragile, hand-blown thing, beautiful in its simplicity and terrifyingly easy to shatter. For weeks, Abigail and Caleb had existed within its delicate confines, their lives measured by the rising and setting of the sun, the crackle of the fire, the quiet sharing of a meal. The world outside, with its cruelty and its debts, had seemed a distant, half-forgotten dream. But the world has a long memory, and it does not forgive. It came on a moonless night, when the darkness was so thick and absolute it felt like a physical weight. A cold front had moved in, and a bitter wind moaned through the pines, rattling the single window of the cabin. They had just finished their supper, a simple rabbit stew, less rich than the one she had first made for him, but filled with the same unspoken care. Abigail was washing the bowls in a basin of hot water by the hearth while Caleb sat at the table, sharpening his skinning knife on a whetstone. The rhythmic shh of steel on stone, a familiar, comforting sound. The first sign of trouble was a low, guttural growl from outside, not from a wolf or a coyote, but a sound of pure human malice. Caleb's hand froze mid-stroke. His head lifted, his body going utterly still, every line of him suddenly taut and alert. He was no longer the quiet homesteader. He was the man she had met by the river, a creature of instinct and coiled readiness. His eyes, fixed on the door, turned to chips of ice. "Get down," he said. His voice was not loud, but it had a low, sharp-edged command that sent a jolt of pure fear through her. Before she could react, another sound split the night, the ugly, triumphant laugh of Jedediah. "You in there, girl stealer. We know you got something that belongs to me. We've come to collect with interest." Abigail's blood ran cold. The stew she had just eaten turned to a leaden ball in her stomach. She looked at Caleb, her eyes wide with terror. He was already moving. He pushed away from the table, his movements swift and silent. He grabbed his rifle from its pegs by the door and then, in a move that seemed almost an afterthought, snatched the small wooden medical box from the shelf. He shoved the box into her hands. "Stay away from the window," he ordered, his voice still a low, controlled whisper. "And stay behind me." Suddenly, a foul, chemical smell filled the cabin, the unmistakable odor of kerosene. A dark, wet stain was spreading under the door. Her mind reeled in confusion, but Caleb knew instantly what it meant. His face, grim in the flickering firelight, became a mask of cold fury. "He's not here for a fight," he breathed. "He's here to burn us out." As the words left his lips, the world outside the door erupted in a blinding flash of orange light. A deafening whoosh followed as the kerosene ignited, and a wall of fire clawed its way up the dry log walls. The single window exploded inward, spraying the room with shards of glass as another torrent of flame was thrown through the opening. The heat was instantaneous and suffocating. The air was filled with the roar of the blaze, the sharp crackle of burning pine, and the splintering groan of the cabin itself. Their sanctuary, their quiet world, had become a funeral pyre. "The back!" Caleb yelled over the roar, grabbing her arm. "There's a loose log behind the cot!" He half dragged, half threw her towards the back of the cabin, the smoke already thick and stinging in their eyes. He kicked the cot aside and tore at a section of the wall. She saw now that what looked like solid logs were, in fact, a cleverly disguised escape route. He wrenched a heavy log free, revealing a dark, narrow opening to the night behind the cabin. "Go!" he shouted, pushing her towards the hole. "Don't stop running. Head for the creek. I'm right behind you." She scrambled through the opening, the rough bark scraping her skin, and fell onto the cold, damp earth outside. The air was blessedly cool but reeked of smoke. Behind her, the cabin was a raging inferno, a monstrous orange beast consuming everything they had built, spitting sparks and embers into the black sky. She could hear the drunken whoops and hollers of Jedediah and his men from the front, their victory cries swallowed by the roar of the fire. She got to her feet and started to run, her lungs burning, her mind numb with shock. She heard a crash as Caleb scrambled out of the opening behind her. He landed on his feet and immediately grabbed her hand, his grip like iron. "This way!" He pulled her into the dense, dark woods, away from the horrifying light of the fire. They ran blindly, crashing through underbrush, branches whipping at their faces. Abigail stumbled, her ankle twisting, but Caleb's grip held her up, pulling her forward with a relentless urgency. The shouts and laughter of their attackers were fading behind them, but the terrifying orange glow still lit the canopy of the trees above them. They had put perhaps 50 yards between themselves and the burning cabin when a single, deafening crack split the night. It was louder than the fire, sharper than the wind. It was the sound of a rifle shot. Caleb grunted. A short, sharp sound of pure, animal pain. He stumbled hard, his whole body lurching forward, nearly pulling her down with him. But he didn't fall. He didn't stop. He squeezed her hand tighter, his knuckles white, and pulled her onward, his breath coming in harsh, ragged gasps. "Caleb," she cried, her voice thin with panic. "Are you hit?" "Don't stop," was all he managed to force out, his voice a strained rasp. "Keep running." They plunged deeper into the forest, a desperate, frantic flight through the absolute darkness. He seemed to be navigating by instinct alone, his knowledge of the terrain etched into his bones. Abigail's world narrowed to the iron grip on her hand, the burning in her lungs, and the terrifying, rasping sound of his breathing. He was leaning on her more now, his powerful stride faltering. But his will was a force of nature, dragging them both forward, away from the danger. They ran until the orange glow was gone, until the sounds of their pursuers had completely vanished, until the only sounds were their own ragged breaths and the pounding of their hearts. They finally slowed to a stumbling walk when they reached the cold, familiar sound of the creek. Caleb led them along its bank, his steps growing heavier, more unsteady. He finally stopped in a small, sheltered hollow, where a cluster of massive boulders formed a shallow overhang. He let go of her hand and sagged against one of the cold, granite stones, his head bowed, his entire body trembling with the effort of staying upright. "We'll be safe here," he gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "For a while." In the faint, ambient starlight, she saw the dark stain spreading across the back of his shirt. It was black in the poor light, but she knew, with a sickening certainty, what it was. "Caleb, you're back," she said, her voice trembling. "Let me see." He tried to wave her away. "It's nothing, just a graze." But as he spoke, his legs buckled. He slid down the face of the rock and collapsed onto the damp, mossy ground with a low groan of pain. The last of his monumental strength was gone. For a moment, Abigail was frozen, paralyzed by a terror colder and more profound than any she had felt by the river. Then, a new feeling, fierce and hot, surged through her. It was a primal, protective rage. They had taken her home. They had destroyed her peace. And they had hurt him. They had hurt Caleb. The frightened girl who had been dragged to the river was gone. In her place was a woman forged in the fire of this night. She knelt beside him, her hands surprisingly steady. "Don't you move," she commanded, her voice imbued with an authority she didn't know she possessed. She remembered the medical box he had thrust into her hands. She still had it, the leather strap clutched in her fist. The hollow was dark, but she remembered the layout of the box from watching him. Her fingers found the latch and opened it. She fumbled inside, her hands searching for the familiar shapes of the bandages, the small, dark bottle of carbolic. "I need to see the wound, Caleb," she said, her voice soft but firm. He didn't answer, his breathing shallow and rapid. With gentle but determined hands, she carefully, painstakingly, cut and tore his shirt away from his back. Her fingers came away wet and sticky. The smell of fresh, warm blood filled the small space. She had to see. She fumbled in the box again, her fingers closing around the small tin of matches he kept for lighting the lamp. Her hands shook as she struck one against the rough surface of a rock. The tiny flame sputtered to life, a fragile, defiant pinprick of light in the overwhelming darkness. She held it close. In the flickering, unsteady light, she saw the wound. It was not a graze. The bullet had entered high on his back, near his right shoulder blade. It was a dark, ugly hole, bleeding sluggishly, the flesh around it already beginning to swell. The match burned her fingers and went out, plunging them back into darkness. But she had seen what she needed to see. The image was seared into her mind. The medic's notebook. She had read pages of it, her curiosity turning into a deep and abiding respect for the knowledge it contained. She had read the section on gunshot wounds. First, stop the bleeding. Second, clean the wound to prevent fever. Third, pack it and bind it tight. Her fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in her stomach. But her purpose was now stronger. Caleb had saved her. He had cleaned her wounds, clothed her, and given her a place of safety. He had shown her a quiet, steady kindness that had healed the broken parts of her soul. Now, it was her turn. Working by touch in the suffocating darkness, her hands became his. She took the clean cloths from the box and pressed them firmly against the wound, her entire body leaning into it, just as she had seen him describe in his notes. He grunted in pain but did not move. She held the pressure, counting slowly in her head, her lips moving in a silent prayer. When the bleeding seemed to slow, she took the bottle of carbolic and, whispering, "I'm sorry, Caleb, this is going to hurt," she poured the harsh antiseptic over the wound. He cried out, a sharp, strangled sound that was quickly suppressed, and his body arched in agony. Tears streamed down her face, for his pain and for her own. But her hands did not falter. She cleaned the wound as best she could in the dark, her touch mimicking the gentle, professional care he had once given her. She packed it with a clean piece of linen and then wrapped the bandages tightly around his chest and shoulder, pulling them snug to keep the pressure on. Her work was clumsy, a shadow of the skill he possessed, but it was done. She was trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline, her clothes damp with his blood and the cold dew of the night. She sat beside him on the cold ground, her hand resting on his forehead. He was hot to the touch, the first signs of fever already beginning. He was unconscious now, or close to it, muttering things she couldn't understand. The protector was helpless. The healer was wounded. All the strength, all the silent competence that had been her shield, was gone. She pulled the remnant of her skirt over his chest for a small measure of warmth and huddled close to him, trying to share her own meager body heat. The cold, wet cave was their only home now, and the night stretched before them, long and filled with danger. But as she sat there in the darkness, her hand on his feverish skin, Abigail was not afraid. She was no longer the girl who was hurt. She was the woman who would heal him, and she would not leave his side. The night was a living thing, a cold, breathing entity that pressed in on their small hollow. The darkness was absolute, a thick, starless black that swallowed all light and form. Abigail's world shrank to the size of the shallow overhang, a space defined not by sight, but by touch, sound, and the sharp, coppery scent of blood. The initial, frantic surge of adrenaline had receded, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and a cold, sharp-edged clarity. Fear was a luxury she could no longer afford. All that mattered was the man lying beside her, his life a flickering candle flame she had to cup her hands around and protect from the wind. His breathing was the metronome of her vigil, a ragged, shallow rhythm that sometimes hitched and caught in his throat. She sat pressed against the cold stone, his head resting in her lap, her fingers gently brushing the sweat-damp hair from his forehead. He was burning. The fever had taken root in the fertile ground of his wound and was now raging through him, a wildfire consuming his remaining strength. She had done all she knew to do. The wound was packed and bandaged. The bleeding stopped, but she knew, from the scant pages she had read in his book, that the real battle had just begun. The bullet was the enemy's scout. The fever was its invading army. She was acutely aware of her own helplessness. In the cabin, there had been a hearth, clean water, herbs, and the accumulated wisdom of his medical notebook. Here, there was only rock, damp earth, and a darkness that hid both danger and remedy alike. The small medical box was a comfort, but it was a finite resource. She had used a precious amount of the carbolic and many of the clean bandages. She had to make them last. Sometime in the deepest hour of the night, he began to mutter. At first, it was a low, incoherent groaning, the sounds of a body at war with itself. But as the fever climbed, the sounds began to form into words. Fragments of thought dredged up from the fevered depths of his mind. "Water, so much water," he mumbled, his head thrashing weakly against her thighs. Can't get the boat across." She understood he was not here with her in the hollow. He was somewhere else, trapped in a fever dream, fighting a battle from a war she would never know. She dipped a corner of a clean cloth into the small amount of water left in their canteen and gently moistened his cracked lips.
"It's all right, Caleb,"
she whispered, her voice a soft, steady murmur in the dark.
"You're safe. Just rest."
Her voice seemed to soothe him for a moment. He fell quiet, his breathing evening out slightly. She allowed herself a small, fragile sliver of hope. But the respite was brief. The fever was relentless. He began to struggle again, his hands clenching into fists at his sides.
"The smoke! Can't see!"
he rasped, a note of panic creeping into his voice.
"Gotta get them out! The children!"
Her heart ached for him. His mind had become a prison, forcing him to relive every nightmare, every moment of pain and failure he had ever known. He was a man who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. And now, with his defenses shattered by fever, that weight was crushing him. All she could do was bear witness, her presence a small, steady anchor in the storm of his delirium. She kept murmuring to him, her voice a low, constant current of reassurance, hoping that some small part of him could hear her through the fog. And then he spoke a name that was not his own, not hers, a name that hung in the cold, damp air with the weight of a prayer. Nora. The name was a raw, broken sound, a plea from the very core of his soul. Abigail's hand stilled on his forehead. The ghost that had lived so quietly between them in the cabin was here now, in the darkness, summoned by his pain. "Nora, I'm sorry," he cried, his voice thick with a grief that transcended the fever.
"The fever! It's so hot! Your hands are so cold!"
He was not in a battle now. He was back in the cabin, in that final, terrible moment, reliving the failure that had defined his life. He was holding his dying wife, and he was helpless. Abigail felt a profound, searing empathy that burned away any possibility of jealousy. How could she be jealous of a memory so pure and so painful? His love for Nora was not a threat to what was growing between them. It was the foundation of the man he was. It was the source of his kindness, his sorrow, his deep, silent strength.
"I wasn't here,"
he sobbed, the sound muffled in the folds of her skirt.
"I was too late. Nora, I'm so sorry. Don't leave me."
His hand, hot and trembling, began to grope in the darkness, searching for a phantom to hold on to. It found her arm, his fingers closing around it with a desperate, feverish strength. He thought she was Nora. He was clinging to her, believing she was the wife he had lost. Tears streamed silently down Abigail's face, not for herself, but for the immensity of his suffering. She could have stayed silent. She could have let him have his ghost for a few fleeting, fevered moments. But she knew that would be a lie, a cruelty. He deserved the truth, even in his delirium. She leaned down, her lips close to his ear, and her free hand came up to cup his cheek, her touch gentle but firm, grounding him in the here and now.
"Caleb,"
she whispered, her voice clear and steady despite the tears.
"I'm here.
It's Abigail." She took a breath, the words a simple, honest declaration.
"I'm not her. I just want to stay."
For a moment, he went still. The frantic energy seemed to drain out of him. He didn't pull his hand away. His grip, in fact, seemed to soften, to change from a desperate clutch to a simple, seeking touch. He let out a long, shuddering sigh, and his body relaxed against her. The name Nora was not spoken again. He had been lost in a sea of memory, and her voice, her honest words, had been the lighthouse guiding him back to the shore of the present. But the fever still raged. His skin was still frighteningly hot. She knew she had to do more. The notebook. Her mind raced, trying to recall the neat, faded script. Willow bark for fever and pain. She remembered the words as clearly as if the book were open in front of her. He had pointed out a stand of willow trees down by the creek just a week before, their long, graceful branches weeping over the water. She had to leave him. The thought was terrifying, but the thought of the fever consuming him was worse. "Caleb, I have to go for a moment," she whispered to his still form. "Just for a moment. I'll be right back, I promise." She gently disentangled his hand from her arm and laid his head down on a bed of moss she had gathered. She took his knife from its sheath, a weapon for a danger she couldn't name, and the empty canteen. Then she crawled out of the relative safety of the hollow and into the oppressive darkness. The night was disorienting. Every tree was a menacing shadow, every rustle of leaves a potential threat. But her purpose was a compass. She kept the sound of the creek to her right and moved slowly, her hands outstretched, feeling her way through the undergrowth. She found the willows by the feel of their smooth, distinctive bark. Working quickly, she used the knife to strip several long pieces from a low-hanging branch. Returning to the cave felt like coming home. She knelt beside him, her heart pounding with relief to find him undisturbed. Now came the difficult part. She had no fire, no pot. She remembered reading about how soldiers would prepare it in the field. She took a strip of the bitter bark and began to chew it, her own mouth recoiling from the taste, until it was a soft, wet pulp. It was a raw, primitive, and desperate act. She gently tilted Caleb's head and used her finger to place the pulpy mass inside his cheek, hoping he would absorb some of its medicinal properties. Then she did it again and again, her own throat raw from the bitterness. The rest of the night passed in a blur of this tender, grueling work. She made trips to the creek to refill the canteen, bringing back cool water to bathe his face and neck. She checked his bandages by touch, relieved to find they were not soaked through. She continued to administer the willow bark pulp, and she talked to him, a low, continuous stream of words, telling him about the stars she couldn't see, about the sound of the water, about the coming of the dawn. She talked to keep the darkness at bay, to keep his spirit tethered to the world, to keep herself from succumbing to the exhaustion that was pulling at her like a physical weight. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the darkness began to thin. A pale gray wash began to seep into the eastern sky, turning the black silhouettes of the trees into charcoal sketches. The birds began to sing their first tentative notes. Dawn was coming. Abigail was slumped against the rock wall, her eyes gritty from lack of sleep, her body aching with a deep, profound weariness. Caleb was quiet now, his breathing deeper, more regular. She dared to hope that the fever had broken. She laid her hand on his forehead. It was still warm, but the raging, unnatural heat was gone. He felt cool, almost clammy, to the touch, as the light grew stronger, filling their small hollow with a soft, gentle glow. His eyelids fluttered. She held her breath. He opened his eyes. They were no longer wild with fever, but clouded with confusion. They roamed the rock ceiling of the overhang, then the medical box, and finally, they settled on her face. He stared at her for a long time, his expression unreadable. He saw the exhaustion etched on her features, the smudges of dirt on her cheeks, the strands of her hair matted with his own dried blood. He saw the fierce, unwavering loyalty in her eyes. His gaze dropped to his hand, which was still resting near hers on the mossy ground. Slowly, with a visible effort, he moved his fingers and covered her hand with his own. His touch was weak, but it was there. It was real. He looked back at her face, and his lips parted. A single dry croak of a word emerged, then another. His voice was a raw, broken whisper, but the words were clear. You stayed. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a confirmation of a miracle. He remembered the darkness, the pain, the terrifying ghosts of his past, and he remembered a presence, a voice, a steady, gentle hand that had refused to let him go. Abigail's exhausted body was overcome with a wave of relief so powerful it felt like a physical blow. The tears she had held back all night finally came, not in a torrent, but in a quiet, steady stream that traced paths through the grime on her cheeks. She didn't try to stop them. She simply nodded, her hand held fast in his. I stayed. The days that followed were a testament to the quiet, stubborn resilience of the human spirit. Their world was a damp, cold hollow of rock. Their roof, the unpitying autumn sky. But within that primitive space, a slow and sacred healing began. The roles that had been so clearly defined on their first night together were now completely and irrevocably reversed. Abigail was no longer the one being cared for. She was the caregiver, the provider, the protector. Caleb's recovery was a slow, arduous journey back to the world of the living. For the first few days, he was lost to the lingering fever and a profound, bone-deep weakness. He slept in long, unnerving stretches, his stillness so complete she would find herself placing a hand on his chest just to feel the reassuring rise and fall of his breath. During his brief periods of lucidity, he was a man adrift, his eyes clouded with pain and confusion. In those moments, she was his anchor. She would spoon cool water from the creek between his lips, clean his face with a damp cloth, and speak to him in a low, steady voice, telling him he was safe, that she was there. She became a creature of the woods, her senses sharpening to a degree she never would have thought possible. The fear she had once felt for the wilderness was replaced by a wary, intimate knowledge. Caleb, even in his weakened state, was her teacher. He could not hunt, he could not forage, but he could speak, lying against the rock wall, his voice a weak rasp. He would guide her. See the tree with the peeling, papery bark, he'd whisper as she stood at the edge of their hollow. Birch. The inner bark can be eaten. The sap, too. The plant with the broad leaves near the water's edge. He'd instruct another day. Cattail. The roots are like potatoes if you roast them in the embers. She listened, and she learned. She set small, clumsy snares for squirrels. Using the techniques he described, most failed. But one day, she returned to find a small creature caught in her trap, and the surge of pride and relief was so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. She learned to identify the edible mushrooms from the poisonous ones, to find the wild onions that brought a sharp, welcome flavor to their meager meals. She was no longer just surviving, she was providing. The most intimate and difficult ritual was tending to his wound. Every morning, in the cool, clear light of dawn, she would gently unwrap the bandages. The first time she did it, her stomach churned at the sight of the angry, inflamed flesh. But she pushed her revulsion aside, her face a mask of calm focus. She remembered the clinical detachment he had shown when tending her own scrapes, and she emulated it. She cleaned the wound with water boiled in their single tin cup, a painstaking process that took nearly an hour. She would use the last of the carbolic sparingly, a single drop to cleanse the area. He never complained, but she could see the effort it took for him to remain still, the sweat that would bead on his brow, the tightening of his jaw as she worked. During those moments, their silence was absolute, a shared space of pain and trust. He, a man of fierce independence and physical power, was completely vulnerable, his well-being placed entirely in her hands. And she, a woman who had spent her life being treated as fragile and expendable, discovered a deep well of strength she never knew she possessed. He was trusting her with his life, and in doing so, He was healing the part of her that had been taught to believe she was worthless. Slowly, day by agonizing day, she saw the signs of his body mending itself. The fierce red around the wound began to soften, to shrink. The fever did not return. The clouded look in his eyes was replaced by his old, familiar clarity. He began to sit up for longer stretches, his back propped against the rock wall, and watch her as she worked. He watched her mend their torn clothes with a crude bone needle she had fashioned. He watched her build a small, smokeless fire with a skill that was becoming second nature. He watched her, and in his gaze, she saw a profound and quiet respect. After nearly 2 weeks, a day came when he pushed himself to his feet, using the rock wall for support. He was unsteady, his face pale and drawn, but he was standing. "The river," he said, his voice still rough but stronger than it had been in days. "We need more water than the canteen holds, and I need to walk." The journey to the river was a slow, careful procession. The last time they had been on this path, he had been the one carrying her, his strength a seemingly infinite resource. "Now," he leaned on her, his arm draped over her shoulders, her smaller frame bearing a significant portion of his weight. She was no longer the damsel in distress. She was the pillar he leaned on. The world had been turned upside down, and in its inversion, they had found their true balance. They emerged from the trees onto the same stretch of rocky bank where he had saved her, but the place felt entirely different. It was no longer a stage for violence and terror. In the soft, golden light of the early morning, with the river whispering peacefully over the stones, it felt like a sanctuary. The air was clean and cold, and the rising sun was just beginning to touch the tops of the distant mesas, painting their edges in hues of rose and gold. She helped him down to a large, flat rock near the water's edge, and they sat together, his side pressed against hers for warmth and support. For a long time, they didn't speak. They simply watched the day being born, listening to the gentle music of the water. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of everything they had endured together: the fire, the flight, the long, dark nights in the cave. It was the quiet of two people who had been to the edge of the abyss and had pulled each other back. He was the one who finally broke the silence. He was not looking at her, but out at the shimmering water, his voice low and thoughtful. "Why didn't you run?" The question was so simple, so direct. It caught her by surprise. She looked at his profile, the strong, weathered line of his jaw, the deep-set eyes that held so much sorrow and strength. "What do you mean?" she asked, though she knew exactly what he meant. "That night," he clarified, his gaze unwavering from the river. "After I was shot, in the cave, you could have left me, taken the canteen and the knife and saved yourself. No one would have blamed you. It would have been the smart thing to do." He turned his head then, and his gray eyes met hers. They were filled with a genuine, searching curiosity. "I was a dead weight, a danger to you. Why did you stay?" She thought for a long moment, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she wanted to give him the truest version of it. She thought of her father, turning away as she was dragged from their home. She thought of Jedediah, his eyes full of contempt, seeing her as nothing more than a piece of property to be used and discarded. She thought of a lifetime of being treated as a burden, an afterthought, a thing with no value of its own. And then she thought of Caleb. She thought of the way he had faced down Jedediah without a word, the way he had gently cleaned her wounds, his touch clinical but respectful, the way he had given her his dead wife's clothes, a silent gesture of dignity, the way he had listened to the whispers of her heart and cooked a memory for her in a pot of stew. He had never asked for anything. He had never demanded anything. He had simply, in his own quiet, profound way, treated her like a human being. She looked away from his intense gaze and out at the rising sun, the light warm on her face. "Because you were the first person who ever acted like I was worth saving," she said, her voice soft but clear. "My whole life, I was a debt to be paid, or a mouth to feed, or a nuisance to be tolerated. No one ever looked at me and saw a person worth keeping. She turned back to him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. You did. That night by this river. You didn't know who I was, but you stood for me. You treated me like my life was worth something. When you were hurt in the dark, leaving you wasn't a choice. It wasn't even a thought. How could I run from the only person who ever made me feel like I had a reason to stay? The truth of her words hung in the clean morning air between them. It was the great, simple, and overwhelming truth of her heart. Caleb stared at her, his face unreadable, but she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a profound and deeply moved understanding. He had performed an act of simple decency, never knowing it was an act of profound salvation for her soul. He had offered her a shield, never knowing he was giving her a reason to live. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply tightened his grip on her hand, his thumb stroking the back of her palm. It was an answer in itself, a silent acknowledgement of the powerful, unbreakable bond that had been forged between them. The sun had cleared the horizon now, bathing them in its gentle, golden warmth. He was still weak, and she was still weary, and their home was a pile of ashes. The future was a vast, uncertain territory, but in that moment, none of it mattered. He did not lean in to kiss her. The gesture would have felt too small for the magnitude of what they had just shared. Instead, he simply shifted his weight, and she, in turn, relaxed against him. She rested her head on his good shoulder, and he leaned his head against hers. They sat there for a long time, two broken people made whole by each other, their hands intertwined, their shoulders sharing a single burden, their faces turned toward the warmth of the rising sun. They were not a man and a woman falling in love. They were something older, something deeper. They were two survivors who had found a reason not to run, a reason to stay and face the dawn. Together, they did not return to the clearing for 3 days. They remained in the shelter of the rocks, living a spare, quiet existence by the creek, allowing the last of the fever to burn out of Caleb and for a measure of strength to return to his limbs. On the 4th morning, he stood, his back still stiff and sore but his eyes clear, and looked in the direction of the place that had been his home. He said nothing, but Abigail knew. It was time to go back. It was time to face the ashes. The walk was silent, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The forest, which had been a place of terrifying flight, was now just the woods, indifferent to their passage. As they drew closer, a funereal smell began to permeate the air, the cold, acrid scent of wet ash and charred pine. It was the smell of a final ending. When they stepped into the clearing, the silence that met them was profound. The morning sun streamed down through the gap in the canopy, illuminating a scene of absolute devastation. Where the sturdy, welcoming cabin had stood, there was now only a blackened square on the forest floor. A few charred, skeletal timbers pointed accusingly at the sky like burnt fingers. The great stone chimney, the heart of the home, was the only thing that remained standing. A grim, solitary monument to a life that had been violently erased. The ground was a uniform carpet of gray and black ash, punctuated by the twisted, unrecognizable shapes of melted tin and blackened iron. Abigail's breath caught in her throat. She had seen the fire, but seeing the aftermath, cold and still in the morning light, was a different kind of horror. This had been their sanctuary. This was where she had learned to sleep without fear, where she had heard him speak his wife's name, where he had smiled for the first time. It was all gone. Caleb stood motionless at the edge of the clearing, his face a mask of stone. He did not look at the chimney or the footprint of the cabin. He was looking at a specific spot near the front, where a small garden of herbs had once grown. Nora's garden, the one he had silently tended. It was now nothing but scorched earth. He was not just seeing the ruins of a building. He was seeing the second death of his wife, the final obliteration of the life he had built with her. A muscle worked in his jaw, the only sign of the storm of emotion raging within him. She saw his shoulders slump, the new, hard-won strength seeming to drain out of him, leaving him hollowed out by a grief too old and too deep to name. He looked, in that moment, utterly and completely defeated. Abigail felt a desperate need to do something, to find some small piece of their life that had survived. She walked slowly into the center of the ruin, her shoes sinking into the soft ash. She looked around at the devastation, at the remnants of their shared life, the warped remains of the cast-iron skillet, the blackened hoops of a water bucket. Everything was broken. Everything was lost. Then she saw it. Lying half-buried in the ash near the base of the chimney was the tin cup she had used as a vase. It was dented and blackened with soot, but it was not broken. It was whole. She knelt and picked it up, wiping the ash from its surface with the hem of her skirt. It was a simple, ugly, worthless thing, but it was theirs. She had put wildflowers in it. She had drunk from it. It had survived. She walked back to Caleb, her boots making no sound on the soft ground. She stood before him and held out the cup. She said nothing. She didn't need to. The offering was a silent question, a quiet insistence. This survived. So can we. He looked down at the cup in her hands, then up at her face. He saw the soot smudged on her cheek, the fierce, unwavering hope in her eyes. He saw the woman who had stayed, the woman who had faced the darkness with him and had not run. He saw her, and he knew he could not surrender to the ashes, not while she was standing beside him. He reached out and took the cup from her, his fingers brushing against hers. He held it for a long moment, its familiar weight a small, solid anchor in a world of ruin. Then he gave a slow, deliberate nod. The decision was made. The work of rebuilding was a slow, arduous prayer offered up in sweat and silence. It began with the clearing of the old. They sifted through the ashes, salvaging what little they could, a few cast-iron tools, the steel blade of his axe, a handful of nails that could be straightened and reused. The rest they buried, a final funeral for the life that had been. Then came the felling of new trees. This was work that required all of Caleb's recovering strength and all of Abigail's newfound resilience. They used a long two-man saw, its blade hungry for fresh pine. They found a rhythm, a silent communication in the push and pull of the steel. His pull was powerful, born of long practice. Her push, at first, was weak and uncertain, but she learned. She learned to put the weight of her body into it, to anticipate his movements, to feel the saw not as an obstacle, but as an extension of their shared will. The rhythmic rasp of the saw cutting through wood became the sound of their new life, a conversation spoken in effort and sweat. They laid a new foundation of stones, larger and deeper than the first. Each stone was a conscious choice, a declaration of permanence. This new home would not be easily shaken. As they worked, their hands would often meet, lifting the same heavy rock, his large, calloused hand guiding hers, her smaller fingers finding purchase in the crevices he could not reach. They were not just building a foundation of rock, they were building a foundation of trust, a partnership forged in shared labor. Raising the walls was a slow, deliberate act of creation. Each log, stripped of its bark and notched with painstaking precision, was a line in a new story they were writing together. The old cabin had been built by Caleb alone, a monument to a solitary love. This one was being raised by two pairs of hands. They would stand on either end of a heavy log, and on a silent count, they would lift, their muscles straining in unison, and walk it into place. The solid, satisfying thud as a log settled into its notches was a small victory, a note of triumph in the quiet woods. As they worked, a new, easy intimacy grew between them. It was a closeness born not of words, but of shared space and common purpose. She would bring him water when she saw the sweat beading on his brow, and he would instinctively move to shield her when a heavy log threatened to shift. They learned the language of each other's bodies, the slight tensing of a shoulder that meant a weight was too heavy, the subtle shift in balance that signaled a need for support. They were two separate people moving as one, their individual strengths and weaknesses complementing each other, creating a whole that was far stronger than its parts. The new cabin was not the same as the old one. It was smaller, more Spartan, built for function, not for comfort. There were no decorative flourishes, no sentimental carvings. It was a fortress, a shelter, a testament to their will to survive. It was not beautiful, but it was sturdy. It was not elegant, but it was true. It was theirs. The day they finally laid the last log of the roof into place, they stood back and looked at their creation. It was a simple, boxy structure of pale, raw pine, smelling sharply of resin and fresh-cut wood. It was a scar on the landscape, but it was a healing scar. "It's a start," Caleb said, his voice rough. It was the first time either of them had spoken about the work itself. "It's a home," Abigail answered softly. They moved back in, their salvaged possessions looking meager and lost in the new, empty space. But slowly, she began to transform it. One afternoon, while Caleb was out hunting, she took one of his old work shirts from the small pile of their salvaged belongings. It was a faded blue chambray, worn soft as flannel, with a tear in the shoulder that was beyond mending. It was the shirt he had been wearing the night of the fire. She carefully cut the shirt into squares, her scissors moving with a deliberate reverence. She laid the pieces out on the floor, arranging them into a simple patchwork pattern. Then, using the needle and thread she had so carefully guarded, she began to stitch them together. Her stitches were small and neat, a line of patient, healing marks on the old, worn fabric. She was not just sewing a piece of cloth. She was mending a memory. She was taking something that had been part of their trauma and transforming it into an object of simple beauty and domestic peace. When Caleb returned that evening, he found the small, rough-hewn table covered with the new tablecloth. The soft, faded blue of the patchwork cloth was a gentle counterpoint to the raw, pale wood of the new cabin. It was a touch of softness, of color, of home. He stopped and stared at it, his eyes tracing the familiar pattern of the faded fabric, the lines of her neat, careful stitches. He understood instantly what she had done. He looked at her, and his eyes were filled with a deep, quiet gratitude that needed no words. That night, as the fire crackled in the new stone hearth, he walked to the wooden chest that had, miraculously, survived the fire. Its thick wood charred but not breached. It was the chest that held Nora's things. It was the chest he had not opened since the day he had given Abigail her clothes. He knelt and lifted the heavy lid. He reached inside, past the folded stacks of lavender-scented linen, and pulled out the small, familiar wooden box, his medical kit. He set it on the table, next to a lit oil lamp. He stared at it for a long time, his hand resting on the lid, his expression lost in 1,000 painful memories. This box was the symbol of his greatest skill and his most profound failure. It was the embodiment of the man he had once been and the ghost he had become. Abigail watched him, her heart still. She knew this was a sacred moment, a turning point she could only witness. With a long, slow breath, he opened the box. The lamplight glinted on the clean, cold steel of the instruments inside. He picked up a small, silver scalpel, its edge still keen, and turned it over and over in his fingers. He was not just holding a tool. He was holding his past, his identity, his pain. He looked up from the instrument, his gaze meeting hers across the small, quiet room. He looked at her, the woman who had used the contents of this box to save his life, who had stitched his past into a tablecloth, who had sat with him in the ashes and given him a reason to build again. A slow, sad, and beautiful smile touched his lips. "Maybe," he said, his voice a low, thoughtful whisper that was more for himself than for her. "Maybe it's time to start over." He was not just talking about the cabin. He was talking about everything. He was choosing to step out of the shadow of his grief. He was choosing to heal. He was choosing to live again. Abigail felt a wave of emotion so powerful it almost took her breath away. She stood up and walked to the table, her footsteps silent on the new floorboards. She stood beside him, looking down at the open box, at the instruments of healing, at the strong, scarred hand that held so much pain and so much potential for good. She reached out and laid her hand over his, her fingers covering his knuckles in a gesture of absolute, unwavering solidarity. Her touch was a silent promise. "Together," she said. The first winter in the new cabin was a quiet baptism by ice and snow. The world outside shrank, the landscape buried under a thick, sound-dampening blanket of white. Their lives, too, contracted, contained within the 4 sturdy walls they had raised together. The silence of their shared existence deepened, but it was no longer the silence of strangers or the heavy quiet of shared grief. It was the comfortable, easy silence of 2 people who had learned to read the weather in each other's eyes and the intent in the slightest gesture. The cabin, once a raw, empty box, began to breathe with a life of its own. Abigail transformed it, her touch a slow, gentle magic. She had woven a rough but warm rug from rushes gathered by the creek before the first frost. The dented tin cup she had rescued from the ashes now sat on a small shelf she had coaxed Caleb into building, and it was rarely empty, holding a sprig of evergreen or a cluster of bright red winter berries. Small, defiant bursts of color against the monochrome world. The patchwork tablecloth, made from the fabric of his old life, was the cabin's undisputed heart, a testament to their shared history of ruin and renewal. Caleb, in turn, was a man slowly, cautiously, re-inhabiting himself. The haunted, solitary shell he had occupied for so long was beginning to crack, allowing the man he once was, the healer, the husband, the man who was useful, to emerge into the light. He had started organizing the medical box, not as a painful relic, but as a set of working tools. One day, a trapper, a grizzled man named Elias, who passed through the territory once a season, stumbled upon their cabin, his hand laid open by a faulty trap. He was wary at first, but Caleb's quiet competence as he cleaned and stitched the wound was undeniable. He had worked with a focused, gentle precision, with Abigail at his side, handing him clean cloths and boiled water, the 2 of them moving with the unthinking synchronicity of a practiced team. The trapper had left with a mended hand and a look of deep respect, leaving behind a small pouch of precious salt as payment. It was the first time Caleb had used his skills to heal another since Nora's death. It was a beginning. Their days were a quiet rhythm of shared labor. He would hunt, his stride stronger than ever, and she would tend the fire, cook their meals, and mend their clothes. They worked together to smoke the venison from his hunts, their hands often brushing in the small, enclosed space of the smokehouse they had built. They sat by the fire in the long, dark evenings, he carving a new handle for his axe, she spinning coarse wool from the trapper into a thin, strong yarn. There were no grand declarations, no passionate embraces. Their love was a sturdier, quieter thing, built log by log, stitch by stitch. It was in the way he would always leave the choicest piece of meat for her, the way she made sure his gloves were always dry and warm by the hearth. It was in the shared glance across the small room, a silent acknowledgement that said, "You are here, I am here, we are safe." The winter broke, as all winters do, in a slow, muddy thaw. The snow receded, the creek swelled with meltwater, and the first green shoots of a new season pushed their way through the damp, cold earth. The world felt new, washed clean, and filled with a quiet, tentative promise. One evening, as a full, silver moon rose in a sky the color of deep twilight, Caleb stood from the table and looked at her. "Let's walk," he said. It was not a command, but a quiet invitation. She knew, without his having to say it, where they were going. She pulled on a thick wool shawl, and they stepped out into the crisp, cold air. They walked in their customary silence, their footsteps soft on the damp ground, their path illuminated by the bright, ethereal glow of the moon. They followed the familiar trail down to the river. The place was transformed. The stark, skeletal trees of autumn were now softened by the faint, lacy promise of new leaves. The river, no longer a thin, whispering trickle, was full and strong, its surface a sheet of rippling silver under the moonlight. The air was filled with the scent of damp earth, wet stone, and the clean, cold smell of the moving water. It was the same spot where their lives had violently collided. But tonight, it was a place of immense and profound peace. They stood on the bank, side by side, close but not touching, and watched the moonlight dance on the current. This river had been the site of her greatest terror, the witness to her utter helplessness. Tonight, she felt no fear. She felt only a deep, abiding sense of peace, a feeling of having arrived at the end of a long and perilous journey. She looked at the moving water, at the way it constantly shifted and changed, yet always remained the river. It had carried her here, a piece of human driftwood caught in a cruel current, and had deposited her at the feet of this silent, steady man. He was like the great granite stones that lined the bank, unmovable, a bulwark against the flood.
"The river brought me to you,"
she said, her voice soft, but the words carried a great weight in the quiet night. She turned her head to look at him. His face was half in shadow, half bathed in the silver moonlight, making him look like a man carved from stone and starlight. "I'm not going to drift away again." It was not a question. It was not a plea. It was a promise, the only one that mattered. It was a declaration that she was no longer the girl who was dragged, the woman who was sold, the victim who was passed from one cruel hand to another. She was a woman who had found her anchor. She was a woman who was choosing to stay. She had laid the simple, unadorned truth of her heart at his feet. Caleb turned to her, his gray eyes luminous in the moonlight. He looked at her for a long, silent moment, and in his gaze, she saw everything. She saw the memory of the fire, the fear in the dark cave, the quiet triumph of their new home. She saw his old grief for the woman he had lost, and his new, fragile hope for the woman who had stayed. He had lived for so long with ghosts and regrets, and here, now, was a future, solid and real and standing right in front of him. He did not speak. Words were his clumsy, unfamiliar tools. They were inadequate for the things he felt, for the profound, overwhelming gratitude and affection that filled his chest. Words were promises, and he had learned the hard way that promises could be broken by fate, by fever, by a moment of being too late. So he answered her in the only language he had ever truly mastered, the language of action. He stepped closer, closing the small space between them, and his arms came around her. It was not a desperate, clinging embrace, but a gesture of absolute, profound certainty. He drew her against his chest, his hold strong, steady, and secure. One of his large, warm hands rested on the small of her back, a solid, reassuring pressure. The other came up to gently cup the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her soft hair, tucking her head into the hollow of his shoulder. He rested his cheek against the top of her head, and she heard him take a long, deep, shuddering breath. It was an embrace that said everything words could not. It said, "I will not let you go." It said, "This is your harbor." It said, "I am your anchor, too." It said, "We will not be broken again." Abigail closed her eyes and leaned into him, her own arms wrapping around his waist, holding on to his solid, steady strength. She felt the slow, powerful beat of his heart against her cheek, a rhythm as constant and reassuring as the river flowing beside them. They stood like that for a long time, two solitary figures merged into one, bathed in the silver light of the moon. In the deep, shared silence, they accepted the ghosts of their pasts and quietly, without a single vow, chose their future. Their home was new, their hearts were mended, and their love, like the river, would keep on flowing. A silent, powerful current that needed no promises to prove it was real. Thank you so much for listening. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and connect with our community. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like and support us further by hitting the hype button so more people can discover this tale.